Welcome to another episode of the BeamG podcast. Today, we want to talk a bit about the role of the narrator. Because one of the most far-reaching decisions an author must make is how to narrate the story. Or in other words, who is telling the story to whom, under which circumstances. To be fair, this question is a relatively new one for authors to ponder. In the pre-modern age, authors just grabbed their quills and started writing. But as novels became more sophisticated, technical questions became more explicit and relevant. Narrative voice, the matter of who is talking here, or what is this text we're reading purporting to be, is a factor at the latest since James Joyce's Ulysses and all the self-aware postmodern novels that followed. Previously, there had already been a difference between author and narrator. When in a novel by Charles Dickens, you, dear reader, are directly addressed, then already there's some sort of discrepancy between the person saying dear reader to you and Charles Dickens the man. But this discrepancy didn't become a popular topic to construct stories around until the 20th century. Now, the role of the narrator is relevant for film as well, but there it's slightly less direct. Anyway, while not a traditional archetype, in many cases not even a participating character, the narrator is never really quite the same entity as the author. So to begin with the basics, the standard narrator types are first person, where usually the protagonist tells his or her own story. Third person, limited, where a narrator tells the story from one character's point of view only, meaning that the audience or the reader is not told of any events that this character is unaware of. And third person, omniscient, where the narrator can relate what any of the characters are doing and thinking and is not limited in what to present to the audience or the reader. In film, first person and third person limited effectively amount to the same thing. The audience gets one person's perspective on the story per shot or scene. There's also the first person point of view camera angle, but rarely is an entire film presented that way. In prose, first and third person is the difference between I did this and she or he or it did that. This is a stylistic choice. In the sense of what the narrator knows and tells, there is not necessarily that much difference. Close or distant. Potentially, there is a big difference between narrative stances. A narrator who is limited to reporting in third person on only one character can do so close or from a distance. In the former, the narrator tends to remain neutral, reporting without explicit commentary. The reader is immersed in the mind and experience of the character. From a distance narration is a sort of bird's eye view of the goings-on in both space and time, and it may bestow upon the narrator a greater awareness, allowing him or her to comment on and display an attitude towards the character who is trapped in the level of plot and interaction with other characters. This style was common in novels of the 19th century, and still today most voiceovers by narrators in movies like this. But the modern style is more this close way of telling a story, where the narrator is closer to the characters that they're describing and not necessarily commenting on what they're doing. The difference between close and from a distance holds for an omniscient narrator too. A close, all-seeing and all-knowing narrator can jump to any character at will. If the author decides to allow the narrator to comment, then that narrator takes on a personality of his or her own. and may even be a character in his or her own right, perhaps to the extent of taking part in the action at some point. A famous example of this technique is John Fowles' The French Lieutenant's Woman. So, the type of narrator determines the degree of discrepancy of awareness between the narrator and the characters. Furthermore, if the narrator has a personality, then it follows that she has an agenda, her own motivations, and perhaps the desire to manipulate the way the reader feels about the characters or the story. And this manipulation may be part of the fiction, so that the author's intention is that the ideal reader sees through the attempts of the narrator character to skew the understanding of the audience. Or perhaps the narrator's memory may simply be faulty. Either way, one speaks of unreliable narrators if they are not to be trusted. The act of telling as part of the fiction. Instead of just writing, many authors picture the situation of the story being told. In the case of a novel, what kind of a text is this supposed to be? Why were these words set onto paper? If there is a definite answer, then there is a narrator figure with some kind of personality, and the text becomes part of the fiction. So the author may choose whether to reveal what sort of text it is that the narrator is ostensibly fabricating, i.e. what the reader is reading or the viewer is watching. A first-person novel may take the form of a certain type of text, for example a journal, which determines the tense the narrator uses and the narrator's awareness. The text type may be clearly named, as in William Boyd's Any Human Heart, which pretends to be a diary, or it may only be revealed later, as in Nabokov's Lolita, which is a defense plea, it turns out. In a first-person story, the narrator can know more than the character, i.e. him or herself, if the narrator is relating the story with benefit of hindsight. For example, as an old person talking about his or her own youth. Coding and decoding. It can be satisfying for the audience, though possibly more because of the thrill of solving a puzzle than through the effects of the story, when an author forces the audience to decode what the narrator tells. For instance, by restricting the narrator to reporting only a character's particular point of view. If the character doesn't understand what's going on, and the narrator does not explain it, the audience might get it anyway. Benji, in The Sound and the Fury, watches them hitting, and it takes the reader a while to figure out that Benji is watching people play a game of golf, but he doesn't have the words to describe it. Similarly, in William Golding's The Inheritors, prehistoric character Locke, for the first time in his life, meets a person from another tribe who holds out a stick to him that shrinks at both ends. Suddenly the tree next to Locke sprouts a branch. Locke has never seen bow and arrow before, and therefore he doesn't understand that he's just been shot at. He doesn't have the words to describe a bow and arrow. The reader, after a bit of decoding, understands more than the protagonist. So implicit in all of this are the following people involved in the act of producing and consuming a story: the author, the narrator, the ideal reader or viewer who understands everything the author is trying to achieve, and you, the real reader or viewer, who may not be paying that much attention. That's it for today. Thanks very much.